Hello, well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm delighted to be here this morning, sharing some of my experience on using baseline data. It's called an approach for international schools, and of course, the vast majority of my experience has been within international schools. And I have found that using data in all of them has been extremely useful. But what do we mean by an international school? Do we mean a school catering for a highly mobile, diverse international community with a very high turnover of students? Or do we mean a school offering an international curriculum to a predominantly stable local population? So I'm not sure what applies to you individually, but I would say in either case, you really need that data. If you're in a school with a predominantly stable local population, then I expect you have a lot of data on your students. You will have their reports, and that will give some level of consistency. But this is showing you their attainment and their progress over time. And if a student has low attainment and you base your expectations of that student on that low attainment, then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy of low attainment, and you really aren't tapping into that student's potential. And that's why I would recommend a baseline test, which is curriculum free, and it gives you another tool in your toolbox to have a look at the potential the student has, its developed ability to access your curriculum, and compare that with the attainment data. And if you see a discrepancy, then you would need to take some action. If you're a school which is catering for a highly mobile, diverse population, then the baseline assessment becomes even more important, because I've looked at many school reports coming in from different schools all over the world, and they normally tell you that someone is making good progress, mediocre progress, not very good progress, but it doesn't tell you the starting point or where they've got to. So how do you know where you start? So a baseline data measure is very useful in giving that starting point for the student. It helps you challenge assumptions based on reports, current attainment data, and allows you to meet the needs of the individual child. Most of the tests used have an adaptive approach. And I'm going to explain what that means. So the tests tend to be computerized, whether you're using Chem Center data or GL data or any different sorts of data. I'm going to be using mainly Chem examples. The students would sit down at a computer and they will answer questions which are presented to them. But no two students gets the same set of questions. So here we have a child who is between average and high ability. She sits down at the computer, she's given a question, she gets the answer right. So she's given a harder question, so she gets the answer right to that one. She's given another one, gets that one right. Then she's given one she can't answer. So the computer gives her an easier question. And this continues until the student's level is established. So it's a very effective way of establishing a student's ability, a snapshot on the day. And it means that time isn't wasted. So it's a curriculum-free test. So you can't prepare for it. It's not testing what a student has learned. It's giving you an idea of how well they can access and flourish in a curriculum taught through the medium of English. So it gives a measure of the developed ability, and that would normally, in most tests, have a reading or vocabulary element, a maths element, and particularly important in international schools, a non-verbal element. So it takes away the pressures of language and gives you an insight into how able the student is at that particular time. Please bear in mind that intelligence can be grown, and this is not a label for life. It's a snapshot of their ability and how well they can access the curriculum. The adaptive approach is individualized, so they can't copy from each other because they'll not be looking at the same questions. It's time efficient, because they won't be answering questions which are too easy for them or too hard for them. And that's very important because that also reduces stress. So they don't get bored if they're very able and they've got lots and lots of easy questions. And they're not stressed if they're finding it difficult because they will not be presented with a whole series of questions they can't answer. So what do the results look like? Now, I'm going to be giving examples from the Incas program, which is for 5 to 11-year-olds, and also the Midias program, which is the Chem Center result tests for 11 to 14-year-olds. What you normally have is a table of results. Normally it's an Excel sheet and they can be sorted in different ways. There can be masses of tables and at first it can be daunting. But you can sort the results yourself and you can do it by cohort. You can have the results of the whole year group, the whole cohort. Or you can sort them by class group so you know just the individuals in your own class. And of course, you can do it by individual student. And that's very important if you're really going to personalize the learning for that individual student. And of course, we also get charts, which I particularly like because they give a visual representation of the data so you can see at a glance where you are. Now, this is cohort data. And this is giving an example from Midias, which gives a picture of the cohort that you have that particular year. I'm using real data here from schools I've worked with in the past. And this shows the overall ability of one particular year group. Now, it's divided into 4 bands, where A is the highest band, B is the next 25%, C is the next 5% down, and D is the lowest 25% of all the students who have been tested. This is really important for school leaders to have a picture of the cohort they're dealing with. In this particular school, you can see that the vast majority of students are in the top half of the ability range, and 64% were in the top 25% of the ability range. If this was a completely average school, it would have 25% of students in each band. But what I find particularly interesting in an international school is to look at the breakdown of that data by test. So keep a picture in your mind of that data showing that 64% of the students are in the very top band. And then look at this graph of the same school at the same data, and it's looking at their vocabulary. And you can see it's quite a different picture, that overall you have a lot of very bright students in that school. But when you look at their vocabulary, you can see that a number of them are going to be handicapped by their lack of language, because we've now got students in that bottom 25%. We didn't have that in the overall. And the percentage in the top band is also much smaller. Now, there's something very important about language learning in academic sense. On average, it takes students between 5 and 7 years total immersion in an English medium school to have complete academic proficiency. This is something called cognitive academic language proficiency, CALP, CALP. So they might have a very good surface command of the language and be able to converse very readily, but in terms of being able to get it down on paper and perform well in exams, it takes a lot longer. We're going to look at the data now for the same group of students, looking at their maths data. And that's a bit more like the overall ability data. We've got a lot of students who are very good at maths. And this is the nonverbal data. Now, at first, I was a little bit surprised by this because normally there's quite a strong link between the nonverbal data and the maths data. And in this school, the nonverbal data was a little bit lower. And then I found out that the previous year, they'd had a real focus on improvement in maths, which it paid off. That's why the math scores were so high. But for a school where English is not the first language of most students, the nonverbal data gives you probably the best measure of your cohort. So looking at that cohort data, have you got the best curriculum in place to meet those students' needs? And you will find that the cohorts vary from year to year. So you can't expect year-on-year improvement. You have to look at the nature of your cohort and find out what it is you need to do to help them make the best progress. So the kind of things a school leader might want to consider is, do you need to have more English in the curriculum? If so, what gets squeezed out? Or do you need to have a strategy of improving English across the whole curriculum, so everyone is responsible for getting that language level up, which is a key factor in how well they're going to do later on in their external exams. Now we'll have a closer look at the assessments for the, I think I should say 5 to 11-year-olds, the younger students. The tests give attainment data for reading and maths. And they also give that magic bit of data, that developability data, which you can compare with your attainment data. It's really important that you have a look at that attainment data and compare it with the developability, because many students can be missed if you don't have that baseline data. If there are significant differences between those schools, you really need to have a closer look at the reasons for this. This is the kind of information you would get from Incas. And again, this is real data from a year 3 class I was involved in doing lots of testing on many years ago, actually, in China. And these are standardized scores. So 100 is average. Anything between 85 and 115 is the broadly average range, although below 90 you would think was low average, and above 110 is high average. If you get over 130, then you're in the top 2% of the ability range. So we're looking there at a whole group of students. Now, if you look at the second one down, Biruk, you can see that this is an extremely bright child. I shall come on to him a little bit later on. But then look at Charlene, who is the 4th student down, and you can see that her developability is high. Her maths and mental arithmetic are average, but her reading is really quite low. I sat down and worked with Charlene, and she could read, it seemed to me, quite fluently, but she couldn't understand it. She was using so much energy, mental brain power in decoding the words that she really didn't have very much left for comprehension. And she needed further assessment, and she turned out to have dyslexia. Similarly, at the very bottom of the list there, you will see a child called Elliot, who was above average in maths and developability. We'll have a closer look at him a bit later on. But again, his reading was suffering, and he was really quite miserable in school because he felt that he should be doing better. And again, he had a specific learning difficulty, which wasn't apparent until we had all of this data in front of us. The data also comes in a very easy form in that it compares the child's actual age on the day they took the test. So you can see that Biruk, who I mentioned as being very bright, was 7 years and 7 months the day he took the test. His reading was on a par with a child who was 12 years and 8 months, and his maths on a par with a child who was 10 years and 6 months. At the very bottom of that table, you will see Riker. Riker was 8 years old and has very similar attainment data to Biruk. Yet in school, they were quite different. Biruk was doing extremely well. He was a very happy, hardworking child, whereas Riker was doing extremely badly and was a very disruptive and naughty child, and was not making good progress at all. And it turned out that she was just incredibly bored, and she had a very different personality from Biruk. He could cope and kind of be a self-starter. She needed more direction, Once she was given more direction, she was given more challenging work, then her behavior improved, and so did her progress. I've also got little asterisks next to Charlene and Elliot, who we'll have a closer look at, and also Yi Ching. So here we have Elliot, and the green line across that chart, and this is where I like these visual charts, shows his actual age on the day he took the test. And the little blue boxes, little squares, they show his actual score on the day of the test. And the lines either side are what are called the confidence limits. So we're 95% certain that if he took the test again on a different day, that his score would lie within that range. Now you can see that Elliot has worked really hard on his decoding, so he can actually pick up a book and say the words. But in terms of comprehension, it's very low indeed, because he can actually read the words, but without much idea of what it is he's able to comprehend. Word recognition is a little bit lower than his word decoding, because in most schools, there's a phonics approach to the teaching of reading. Now, if we have a look again at Elliot, at the very bottom there, you can see his age. And if you look at his developed ability, it shows that he's a really able little boy. And he just really wasn't progressing until he was assessed. And then he was sent to the special educational needs coordinator for further assessment. And then he was given support to help his dyslexia and made good progress following the identification of his special needs. Yi Ching had very poor word decoding and also poor comprehension. You can see that his word recognition is about what you would expect for a child of his age. He was 8 years old, as you can see from the green line showing his age, but his word decoding and comprehension were lower. Now, the approach for teaching this year 3 group was focusing on decoding, but Yi Ching was used to a pictorial language. He was Chinese, so he was much better at word recognition than he was at decoding. He needed a different approach from the rest of the class to enable him to learn to read. He had much more difficulty with phonics because he was more used to a pictorial language. So it's important that you can see the profiles of students of similar ability can be quite different, and that will inform your approach to supporting them. I'm going to now look more carefully at the secondary assessments. And here we have individual pupil records, which, a bit like the data we've seen from the primary assessments, gives you a nice picture of each child. It gives an overall measure of developed ability, and it gives a profile of the scores across the components of the test. And that helps you identify those individual needs. This is an example of an individual pupil record. And if you have a look there at the vocabulary score for this child, you can see that that's 116, which puts them into band A. If you remember, band A is the top 25% of the ability range. I'm going to ignore the stay lines for now. Look at the percentile rank at the end of that table. The percentile rank is 86. That means only 14% of students who took the test did better than this particular student. But then look at their math score. Their math score is only 73. That puts them in the D band. That's the bottom 25% of the ability range for maths. And looking at the percentile rank, you can see it's a 4, meaning that 96% of students did better than that student on the test. Now, this is not telling you the reason why. It might be that on the day of the test, the student just refused to do most of the questions, or it might be that they have a particular difficulty with maths. You as a teacher would know that student, you would know their attainment data, and that would help you make more sense of it. So overall, the student is coming out there with an overall attainment puts them in the bottom 25%, but their profile shows great inconsistencies, and that's what you would need to be looking at. Again, like the scores I showed you before, the square is the actual test result on the day of the test, the snapshot test, and the lines, the little whiskers on that on the square, shows that we're 95% certain that if they took the test again, that their score would lie within that range. So you need to look for inconsistencies to find out what might be wrong with that particular student. And here we have a couple of examples to share. We've got two students come out overall as average ability. So they've got the same ability according to the overall test, but their profiles are quite different. The first student has very low vocabulary and high maths. And the other student has a very high vocabulary and low maths, and their nonverbal ability is on the low side, whereas the other student had higher nonverbal ability. So you might want to look at the top student, find out maybe they've got English as an additional language, perhaps they have a special educational need, but either way, they will need some support to get that vocabulary level up to a higher level. The student at the lower part of the graph has a lower math score. Now, the math test, although we say curriculum free, it will depend a little bit on the experience of being taught maths. So we would need to find out what that student's gaps were, or whether they had a particular difficulty in maths and needed extra support, perhaps they have dyscalculia. So you get an awful lot of information from the individual pupil records to help individual students. But also from the cohort data, you get information about the whole year group, which will help you make sure that your curriculum is designed to meet their needs. So why do you need to use that baseline data? Well, I think there are three key bits of data every teacher needs. They need baseline data, attainment data, and progress data. If they've got those three bits of data, then they can really accelerate progress for every child. So the school leaders need the data, actually the cohort data, to design the curriculum and deploy resources based on need. If you've got, say, 3 classes in a primary school and they've all got a teaching assistant, but when you look at the data for those classes, you find that some classes have got greater needs, then maybe you need to deploy your teaching assistants differently. Class teachers have got an insight into the strengths and areas for development for each child. And at the beginning of the school year, that data is invaluable. You don't have to spend a month or 6 weeks getting to know your children. If you take the test at the beginning of the school year, you've immediately got an insight into the strengths and the areas for development. It also means that your special educational needs department and your EAL departments have got an early screening tool. So they can use that to target which children need further assessment, saving time and again, meeting their needs more quickly, including gifted children like Rock. So those gifted children can be identified and given appropriate challenge. And if you've got all of that information, then appropriate interventions can begin earlier. Now I've hurried through that because I know you'll have questions, and I'm looking forward to getting those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was really, really useful and insightful as well. We already have a number of questions. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions for Sue, please post these in the Q&A box and we'll put these over to Sue now. So the first question we've received is from Amber, and she has asked, can baseline assessments be used as admission or entrance tests?
Well, they're not designed for that, but I know some schools do, because they will get some kind of, they will get a picture of the child before entering the school. But that's not how they're designed, although I'm saying they are widely used for that purpose. Some tests give kind of fairly instant feedback, like the GL assessments do. Others take a little bit longer to get it. So it depends on how you want to organize your admissions procedures. If the school is highly selective, it probably has some attainment test for a student to go in, but most international schools tend to be non-selective unless a child has got special educational needs that they can't meet.
Thank you, Sue. Another question here, this one from Lindy. What is the difference between Cambridge checkpoint tests and baseline assessments in terms of results and performance reports?
Okay, so a Cambridge checkpoint test is an attainment test. It's measuring how well they've learned what they've been taught. Whereas a baseline test is curriculum free, and it gives you an indication of a child's developed ability and how well they can access the curriculum taught in English. So they're measuring different things, and I would suggest that you need both to get a picture of the child. You need the baseline test, which gives you a kind of a measure of their potential to do well. It's a snapshot of their ability at that moment. So that would be at the beginning of the process, whereas the checkpoint attainment test is at the end of the process to see how much they have attained during that time period.
Fantastic, thank you, Sue. Another question here, this one from Ethelinda. What is the name of application in calculating individual pupil records? So what was it that what example was that from? Which program?
Oh, the pupil record was an example from Mid-Years, which is the Mid-Years information system, which is a Chem Centre test designed for 11 to 14-year-olds.
Fantastic, thank you. And another question, this one from Rebecca. Are these tests tailored to consider how knowledge bases differ in different countries?
Well, obviously, because they're in English, I suppose they're geared towards Western culture, I suppose. But in terms of the vocabulary they might use, but they are used worldwide. I mean, an example I can think of is, I don't know how many of you know Hong Kong, but one of the most famous landmarks in Hong Kong is the Peak. And so when the language vocabulary test had the word peak in it, all the Hong Kong students understood what it meant. So, it a little bit depends on local context, but they're generally curriculum free, but they can't be entirely culture free, especially the language test, or the non-verbal test, of course, is completely non-verbal, so it's not dependent on any particular culture.
Thank you, Sue. Another question here, this one from Abdul. How can we measure emotional intelligence or situational intelligence to have a deeper insight on each of our students? Well,
these tests certainly aren't designed to measure emotional intelligence. I think a teacher would have that from working with the students and observing them, how they interact with other students, and how well they can cope with stresses. I mean, I think lots of students have been under a lot of stress with distance learning and everything that the pandemic has brought. So I think their resilience has been tested, but it's not something that these kind of tests can measure, although they're very important to their well-being.
Thank you, Sue. And just touching on that point in terms of the current climate and the pandemic, after a couple of months of summer break and the current situation, students become reluctant to sit a test and thus tend to perform poorly on baseline assessments. How could we ensure the accuracy of the results regardless of the variables involved?
Well, you are the best person to judge how things are in your school. But I think one of the things about these tests, the adaptive test, and with my experience, is that the students who often are very keen on computer games don't see this as being very much different. Because the tests are adaptive, they're quite good fun. Certainly for the Incas, I think is totally brilliant. The students just love it. I mean, they've got their headphones on, they're doing the test, when they get to the end of each little module of the test, the headphones, they can hear a little round of applause, and they get a little happy face on the screen. So it's not like sitting down in a hall and doing a horrible exam. They're sitting down at a computer with their headphones on, having fun, really. I mean, I think most of the students find them fun and not stressful, and they take them pretty seriously. You know, I've worked with students in year 2 and year 3 who have been really happy doing these tests. No one's been stressed by them, and they've taken it seriously. And of course, the data is a snapshot. It's not a label for life, as I said earlier, but it gives you an indication of where they are. And it's useful to do it at the very beginning of the school year, because especially if students haven't been reading over the long summer break, you might find that their literacy levels have gone backwards. And so you can't expect to begin where you left off in the summer when you start the new school year.
Definitely, I think that's really important. So another question from this one from Arpana. How do baseline assessments help the academically strong students?
Well, I don't think it's meant for academically strong or academically weak. It's to give you a snapshot of that student's ability. And I think, you know, the example I quoted of those 2 children, Biruk and Riker, who were both very, very able. One was doing well, and Riker wasn't. And it was because Riker needed to be challenged. And her needs hadn't been identified. So the test was extremely useful for her because it gave the teachers a very different perspective of her ability, and they could give appropriate challenge. And she thrived from there on.
Fantastic, thank you, Sue. We've got a question here from Peter, who has asked, how reliable are the Chem tests compared to regular summative tests taken throughout the year?
Well, they're measuring different things. Your regular summative tests throughout the year are attainment tests, and they're measuring what has been taught. Whereas the baseline tests are curriculum free, and they give a snapshot measure of the student's potential to do well in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. And touching on the developability, Hazira has asked, could you give an example of developability questions? Don't know if we can think of one off the top of our head.
Well, I mean, there are various. I mean, in the test, for example, they would be given a series of shapes and have to identify the next one in the sequence. So there's like nonverbal communication. For the vocabulary test, they might be given a sentence. I'm thinking of Midias here with a choice of 3 different words, and they have to choose the most appropriate word to fit into that sentence. You know, there are lots of different examples, but I can't show any here because I don't have any examples I can flash up on the screen.
Thank you, Sue. A question here from Abarabu. Is 150 the maximum score for each skill and the total score in all Chem assessments? I think 150 was one of the scores that you mentioned in the individual pupil records.
I think I said 115. Yeah. Basically, you might get scores from an extremely able person that would go up to 150. But basically, we're looking at a typical normal distribution, like a bell curve. And so you would find that the scores are standardized with 100 being average. Okay, so 100 is always the average. They have a standard deviation of 15. That means that 68% of the population will have scores that fall within 85 and 115. Then you will find that about 14% of the population have got scores between 115 and 130. And then you will find that the top 2% of the ability range will have scores of over 130. So anything over 130 is exceptionally able. At the other end of the scale, those who've got scores of 85 or below are in the bottom 14%. So they might have a particular difficulty or maybe lack of English, which is if it's a vocabulary test. If they've got scores of below 70, that puts them into the bottom 2% of the ability range, and they'd be very challenged at that stage. Or it could be that they just haven't got the language at all.
Thank you, Sue. And another question, this time one from Peter. Would it be appropriate to stream classes based on Chem data?
It's interesting because I think you need a combination of attainment data and baseline data. When I was working in a school, a very large school, actually in Qatar, and I looked at the Chem data, and so students who were very able, but maybe had lack of English, I insisted that they went into the highest science and math sets, but had additional support for their English, because I felt that they were being held back if they were put into a low ability grouping simply because of their lack of English. So I would use a combination of both. But what you need to do is if you've got a very able student and you put them in a group with able students, but they've got a particular problem, say with language, then you have to be able to add that support so that they will be able to cope in that group. But I would certainly look at both attainment and baseline data if you're going to have setting or groupings.
Definitely, and I think there's having those 2 data points, I think it just provides that bigger picture, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and I think there's a real, there were students who had a similar attainment levels for reading, but some students were very bright students who had English as an additional language, were just new to the language, and there were other students who had generalized learning difficulties and were making very slow progress. So because they had the same data point for attainment, but they had very different needs. And so you couldn't just group them together and say, we'll do the same program for these students. Their needs were different. And so you need to use both sets of data.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Sue. Another question here. Would you share baseline data with parents? Have you done so? And if so, how would you do it?
Well, I certainly wouldn't send it home like a certificate, like this is their report. But I have shared it with parents to discuss their individual needs. For example, with Elliot, who I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, I did sit down with his mum to say that he was a very bright little boy who was struggling in school because he had a specific difficulty, which we were beginning to address. And she was extremely relieved to see that data. And they were going to be leaving China and moving on. And so I gave her the data so that she could show to her new school, or the new school for Elliot, to explain what his needs were, but also the fact he was very bright. He just had a specific learning difficulty. So I think how you share it is important. You can't just send it home. But I do think that when you're having a parents meeting, one-to-one meeting with a parent looking at progress, then you could share some of that data to show how you've arrived at the program of learning you're using with that child and what difference it's making to their progress.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sue. And question here from Abdul. Can we tailor or customize these tests as part of the requirements of the schools?
No, I think they're the whole idea of them is that you have the same questions asked to thousands of children in hundreds of schools. So it's not a tailor-made. It's a general test, but extremely useful. I found Incas, I think, is just totally brilliant in terms of the information it gives you on each child. I mean, I gave you examples there at how it breaks down their reading skills. But it was the same in maths, including breaking down the math into multiplication, addition, subtraction, division. It gives so much information. On those developed ability scores, it gives a nonverbal score plus a language-based score. So again, you can easily get more information on those students. So they're not customized per school, but what they give you is a fantastic profile of each child.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sue. I wondered whether you could explain, because I know we get these questions again and again, kind of what is meant by nonverbal and nonverbal ability?
Okay, so the tests would be on things like spatial awareness, matching patterns, looking at symbols. So it's logical, it's logical thinking, but it's not dependent on language. So that would give you a very good idea of a child's ability, which is not dependent on language. Problem solving, matching shapes, 3D visual, having a flat shape and imagining it in 3 dimensions, or having a 3D shape and imagining it flat. So it's this kind of 3D visualization, matching patterns, finding the next symbol in a sequence. So completely devoid of language. It's really, really good fun, good puzzles.
Yeah,
Kids
definitely
really enjoy doing them.
Thank you, Sue. Just as a quick reminder, we've only got a couple of minutes left. So if you've got any last minute questions for Sue, please post these in the Q&A box. I have a question that I'd like to ask Sue. So my question is, who should be responsible for data in a school in terms of policy and implementing it?
Well, the senior leadership team obviously need to be looking at all the cohort data, because that should determine what resources they need and how they should be deployed. So in overall responsibility, the senior leadership team have to have that responsibility. But in terms of using the data within the class, then that's the individual classroom teacher who's responsible for looking at that data and discussing it either with their year leader or deputy head, whoever is their teaching and learning and curriculum that they would need to discuss that with. So the overall responsibility is for the senior leadership team, but every single classroom teacher should be using that data so that they can accelerate the progress of their children.
Thank you so much, Sue. And actually, we've just received a question on that, on around kind of teachers, and Abdul's asked any such tests for teachers, but I think you've covered it there, that it's actually appropriate for, it's useful for classroom teachers too, you know, having that the data on those students and being able to use it to inform, you know, learning and learning plans and etc. Is there anything else you'd maybe like to add to that?
I would just say that I think the classroom teacher is the person who most needs the data, because it's when you've got the data in the hands of the teacher that you have an impact on teaching and learning. Whereas the overall cohort data and the curriculum design is very important, but that's the senior leadership team to make sure that they've got the right curriculum structures in place. But in terms of dealing with the individual students, it's absolutely essential, I think, that the classroom teachers have the data, understand the data, and actually use it. There's no point in being data rich and paying for these programs unless they're actively used in improving the teaching and learning in the classroom.
Thank you so much, Sue. That's actually all we have time for today, but I think that's ended on a really important note. So we hope you all enjoyed the webinar. Thank you all so much for all the questions, and apologies if we didn't get around to answering yours today. Also, a huge thank you for Sue for presenting the session and taking the time to be with us today. As we said earlier, we'll be uploading a recording of the session to YouTube, so you will be able to revisit the webinar and share with colleagues, etc. So that leaves us just to say, we really hope you enjoy the rest of the day in the conference, and thank you, a huge thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your very interesting questions.